Another day, another story. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense, 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, just 19 miles from US shores. In a TV address on October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy, 1917-63, notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decision to enact a naval blockade around Cuba, and made it clear the U.S. was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. Following this news, many people feared the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Welcome to Tabo Imminent Channel. However, disaster was avoided when the U.S. agreed to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's 1894-1971 offer to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day political and military standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union in October 1962. It is considered one of the most tense moments of the Cold War and brought the two superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was triggered when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in Cuba, which was an ally of the Soviet Union. The U.S. government, led by President John F. Kennedy, responded with a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further shipments of Soviet missiles and demanded the removal of the existing missiles. The world watched anxiously as tensions escalated, and there was a real fear of nuclear conflict. After intense negotiations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, a resolution was reached. The U.S. agreed to publicly declare that it would not invade Cuba, and the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle its missile sites in Cuba and remove the missiles. Additionally, the United States secretly agreed to dismantle its missile sites in Turkey. The crisis officially ended on October 28, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is considered a turning point in the Cold War, as it highlighted the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and led to increased communication between the US and the Soviet Union to prevent similar crises in the future. It also prompted the installation of a direct hotline between the leaders of the two countries to improve communication and reduce the risk of misunderstandings that could lead to nuclear war. Discovering the missiles. After seizing power in the Caribbean island nation of Cuba in 1959, leftist revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, 1926–2016, aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Under Castro, Cuba grew dependent on the Soviets for military and economic aid. During this time, the US and the Soviets, and their respective allies, were engaged in the Cold War, 1945–91, an ongoing series of largely political and economic clashes. The two superpowers plunged into one of their biggest Cold War confrontations after the pilot of an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Hazer making a high-altitude pass over Cuba on October 14, 1962, photographed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. President Kennedy was briefed about the situation on October 16, and he immediately called together a group of advisors and officials known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. For nearly the next 2 weeks, the president and his team wrestled with a diplomatic crisis of epic proportions, as did their counterparts in the Soviet Union. A new threat to the U.S. For the American officials, the urgency of the situation stemmed from the fact that the nuclear-armed Cuban missiles were being installed so close to the U.S. mainland, just 90 miles south of Florida. From that launch point, they were capable of quickly reaching targets in the eastern U.S. if allowed to become operational. The missiles would fundamentally alter the complexion of the nuclear rivalry between the U.S. and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, which up to that point had been dominated by the Americans. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had gambled on sending the missiles to Cuba with the specific goal of increasing his nation's nuclear strike capability. The Soviets had long felt uneasy about the number of nuclear weapons that were targeted at them from sites in Western Europe and Turkey, and they saw the deployment of missiles in Cuba as a way to level the playing field. Another key factor in the Soviet missile scheme was the hostile relationship between the US and Cuba. The Kennedy administration had already launched one attack on the island, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, in 1961, and Castro and Khrushchev saw the missiles as a means of deterring further US aggression. Kennedy weighs the options. From the outset of the crisis, Kennedy and ex-com determined that the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba was unacceptable. The challenge facing them was to orchestrate their removal without initiating a wider conflict and possibly a nuclear war. In deliberations that stretched on for nearly a week, they came up with a variety of options, including a bombing attack on the missile sites and a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy ultimately decided on a more measured approach. First, he would employ the US Navy to establish a blockade, or quarantine, of the island to prevent the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment. Second, he would deliver an ultimatum that the existing missiles be removed. In a television broadcast on October 22, 1962, the president notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decision to enact the blockade, and made it clear that the US was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. Following this public declaration, people around the globe nervously waited for the Soviet response. Some Americans, fearing their country was on the brink of nuclear war, hoarded food and gas. Showdown at sea, US blockades Cuba. A crucial moment in the unfolding crisis arrived on October 24, when Soviet ships bound for Cuba neared the line of US vessels enforcing the blockade. An attempt by the Soviets to breach the blockade would likely have sparked a military confrontation that could have quickly escalated to a nuclear exchange. But the Soviet ships stopped short of the blockade. Although the events at sea offered a positive sign that war could be averted, they did nothing to address the problem of the missiles already in Cuba. The tense standoff between the superpowers continued through the week, and on October 27, an American reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, and a US invasion force was readied in Florida. The 35-year-old pilot of the downed plane, Major Rudolph Anderson, is considered the sole US combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see," recalled US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, 1916 to 2009, as quoted by Martin Walker in the Cold War. A similar sense of doom was felt by other key players on both sides. A deal ends the standoff. Despite the enormous tension, Soviet and American leaders found a way out of the impasse. During the crisis, the Americans and Soviets had exchanged letters and other communications, and on October 26, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy in which he offered to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise by US leaders not to invade Cuba. The following day, the Soviet leader sent a letter proposing that the USSR would dismantle its missiles in Cuba if the Americans removed their missile installations in Turkey. Officially, the Kennedy administration decided to accept the terms of the first message and ignore the second Khrushchev letter entirely. Privately, however, American officials also agreed to withdraw their nation's missiles from Turkey. U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, 1925-68, personally delivered the message to the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and on October 28, the crisis drew to a close. Both the Americans and Soviets were sobered by the Cuban Missile Crisis. The following year, a direct hotline communication link was installed between Washington and Moscow to help defuse similar situations, and the superpowers signed 2 treaties related to nuclear weapons. The Cold War was and the nuclear arms race was far from over, though. In fact, another legacy of the crisis was that it convinced the Soviets to increase their investment in an arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the US from Soviet territory. The Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded in a series of events that heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Discovery of missiles in Cuba, October 14, 1962. U.S. intelligence discovered evidence of Soviet missile installations in Cuba, including photographic evidence of missile sites under construction. President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the situation. Naval blockade, October 22, 1962. In a televised address, President Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles and declared a naval blockade, referred to as a quarantine to avoid the term blockade, around Cuba to prevent further shipments of Soviet military supplies, particularly missiles. 13 days of crisis, October the 16th to the 28th, 1962. Over the next 13 days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war as the US and the Soviet Union engaged in intense diplomatic negotiations. The US military was on high alert, and both superpowers prepared for the possibility of military conflict. Diplomatic negotiations behind the scenes. There were secret negotiations between the US and the Soviet Union. The US conveyed its demand for the removal of the missiles from Cuba. Meanwhile, the Soviets sought assurances that the US would not invade Cuba and proposed removing US missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev's letters. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent 2 letters to President Kennedy, offering different terms for resolving the crisis. The first letter proposed removing the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba. The second letter, received later, suggested removing the missiles if the US lifted the blockade and agreed not to invade Cuba. Kennedy's response. President Kennedy, while publicly accepting the terms of the first letter, secretly agreed to the removal of US missiles from Turkey to address Khrushchev's concerns. Resolution, October 28, 1962. Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba, and the crisis came to an end. The US publicly pledged not to invade Cuba, and privately agreed to dismantle its missiles in Turkey. Aftermath. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a significant moment in Cold War history. The superpowers recognized the need for direct communication to prevent future crises, leading to the establishment of the hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. It also highlighted the importance of diplomatic solutions in managing international conflicts. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.